So what's public AI? Public AI is, first off, really an idea that AI can and should be a form of public infrastructure. Think highways or libraries or water or electricity or even the internet. And that it shouldn't be owned by two or three giant technology companies in San Francisco or in Shenzhen, right? That concentration of power that exists in the world and within the AI industry right now. Like two or three companies control, I would say, more than 95, 98% of the global market share for consumer chatbots. ChatGPT itself has around 80%. Most countries, and these are becoming very critical technologies, right? For industry, but also for culture, you know? People are kind of realizing, oh, if British culture, if Icelandic culture, if Swedish culture all comes through these giant engines that all effectively live in San Francisco, or being trained in Shenzhen or Shanghai, you know, where does my culture go? Kind of national security concerns about who has control over this infrastructure, right? If, you know, somebody were just turn this off, would the economy just suddenly stop? Or how much of the economy, or how many businesses would have to shut down or pause operations? So when you have a good model, like Switzerland recently released, people adopt it, they put it into their workflows, they use it just like they use ChatGPT. Or I think there are other things that are going to emerge over time where countries and industries and companies realize, hey, it's really important that we have our own localization of these large language models.
Yeah.
Otherwise, something is lost in our culture, but also in our ability to produce things and to do business in the way that we want to.
Welcome to the AI Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Ashley Braganza, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Josh Tan from Public AI to this particular episode. Josh, before we go much further, could I ask you to introduce yourself and say something a little bit about Public AI as well, please?
Yeah, of course. Hi, folks, and thanks so much for having me on, Ashley. So I'm Josh. I'm a mathematician, computer scientist, though, to be fair, I mostly write emails these days. My background's in theoretical machine learning and kind of economics that I did at a few different institutions. But mostly I help lead the movement for public AI and a lot of our product work. So what's public AI? Public AI is, first off, really an idea that AI can and should be a form of public infrastructure. Think highways or libraries or water or electricity or even the internet. And that it shouldn't be owned by two or three giant technology companies in San Francisco or in Shenzhen, right? That this isn't the kind of setting or world that most people want to live in. Public AI is also a movement. And lastly, it is a set of real things, big AI models, front ends, services, and products that you can download on your phone today.
Josh, thank you for that introduction. Tell me a little bit more about Public AI. I mean, you've talked about what it is and given some analogies, but are there models of Public AI that currently exist?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of, let's put it this way, a lot of different countries are implementing different versions of Public AI. It's really interesting to see the variation. So for example, in Switzerland, we do a lot of work with Swiss entities, with the Swiss National AI Initiative, also known as Swiss AI. And what they did is they trained their own large language model. It's a 70B and 8B model family called Apertus that was released a few months ago, actually, on September 2nd. We, as Public AI, were the primary deployers of Apertus, at least to the globe and more recently to a lot of Switzerland as well. And Apertus is, this is where the government decided, like, we need our own large language model. We need a national AI, right? In other places, let's say Singapore, and we also do some work there, they also trained their own model, but more recently they started effectively post-training off of an existing open source model called Gemma from Google. But their strategy is more toward how can we use AI, it's provisioned publicly, it's through public funding, but how can we use it in order to bring together regional players, so other people in Southeast Asia around Singapore, like Malaysia, Indonesia, um, Vietnam to some degree. You can also see this in places like the UK. So there's a lot of public compute in the UK and in many other countries where governments are investing in data infrastructure, compute infrastructure, and provisioning it for, among other people, universities, but sometimes also for the general public, right? And I would say that is also very much a form of public AI.
And why is public AI important? What is the need for public AI?
So I think Diane Coyle, professor at Cambridge, a year or so ago, sort of discussed this idea of a public option. Bruce Schneier and Nathan Sanders of Harvard University also brought up the same idea, also about a year ago. And what public AI is trying to be, and public option is just one form of this, right? But it's sort of saying, how can we have a kind of public alternative to the private options? How can we, try to prevent this process of enshittification that happens to so many of our technologies where we get used to it? Companies, when they're sort of trying to get market share, they like, oh, hey, here's this wonderful product for very, very cheap. And then they slowly just turn the dial up in terms of price and down in terms of product quality. And then we're stuck in this world where nobody really enjoys using the products anymore, but we're kind of stuck with them because that's the only option. So that's one reason. I think there are a lot of other reasons, questions around public interest. So in the US, for example, in many other countries, there was this process of rural electrification where governments really spent quite a bit of money and made an effort to make sure that everybody was benefiting from this amazing new technology called electricity. I think right now, governments are in the same boat. They're thinking, well, how can I make the right kinds of investments and implement the right kinds of programs to allow everybody to benefit from AI rather than just the people who can afford, I don't know, $1,200 a year or $2,400 a year on the most expensive version of ChatGPT.
So, Josh, if public AI is the answer, what's the problem here? What problem or is public AI fixing?
So I think a big part of what we're trying to address is the incredible concentration of power that exists in the world and within the AI industry right now. Like 2 or 3 companies control, I would say, more than 95, 98% of the global market share for consumer chatbots. ChatGPT itself has around 80%. Most countries, and these are becoming very critical technologies, right, for industry, but also for culture. People are kind of realizing, oh, if British culture, if Icelandic culture, if Swedish culture all comes through these giant engines that all effectively live in San Francisco, we're being trained in Shenzhen or Shanghai, where does my culture go? Do I still have British culture? Do I still have Swedish culture, Swiss culture? Where's that coming from anymore? I think there's a other side to this, which, I'll say, very much reflects kind of national security concerns about who has control over this infrastructure, right? If, somebody were just turn this off, would the economy just suddenly stop? Or how much of the economy, or how many businesses would have to shut down or pause operations because of something like this, right? We live in a more and more tense and, let's just say, tense world where alliances are shifting all the time, it seems. So I think many governments are thinking very, very much about this. Yeah, so I would say like a large part of it comes from concentration of power issues. A portion of it also just comes from a sense of just, these models were built using our data. They were trained on the product of civilization, and they are being used to benefit a very, very few people. And how can we flip that around? How can we make sure that these technologies really do benefit everybody? I think that's a big question that we're trying to figure out and address within the realm of public AI.
So is public AI a kind of a form of open source AI? Is that what we're trying to get to here?
We actually had a paper out in ICML recently, but addressing exactly this question. I think public AI and open source AI are a little bit different. But in practice, every single public AI that exists, especially public AI model that exists right now, is open source. So is the entire public AI inference utility. Like every product that I build, my team builds, is also open source. We're very much, I think, trying to support and part of the open source movement. But there's also a way in which, I've studied open source for a long time. And open source has a lot of issues when it comes to maintenance. who's paying for, the software to continue to be maintained and updated and responding to changes, adding new features. And I think what open source is seeing is that it's very hard to maintain or build new models, especially when those things cost upwards of $100 million for a single one, right? That's not the same kind of business model that open source can maintain. So public AI is also really trying to figure out, how do we build a sustainable economic model that will allow open source models, open source AI to continue to be built?
And I know from previous discussions, you've talked about the flywheel effect. I just wondered if you could explain to the listeners what's meant by the flywheel effect.
So here's a problem that many open source model builders have. So I would include people like Swiss AI Sweden, the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, AI Singapore. I know Bangor University in the UK trained a UK sort of national model as well. And the issue is that most of these labs, they are researchers. Actually, all the labs I mentioned, they are researchers. They are not product people. They are not, they don't have a giant product team that a lot of these big companies have. What that means is all they do is put it on something called Hugging Face, but effectively it's a place where you download open source models, and they hope for the best, right? They just like wait for people to download it. And if you ever try to use and deploy one of these models just using the weights, it is actually really hard. The vast majority, 99.9% of people can't do it. I can't really even do it. It takes, hardware, it takes expertise. What this means is that it's just hard for open source on its own to get out there and be used by everybody. And that's why, public AI, at least some of the work that we do, is specifically trying to address this.
So Josh, thanks for that. But just tell me again, what's the flywheel effect?
Yeah. So the flywheel effect, to be specific, is in order for these open source models to keep getting better, they need to deploy, right? They need to get users, they need to get the data, they need to understand who's using it and for what. Yeah. And all these things can't happen if all they're doing is putting some weights online, and hopefully some people use it and they don't have no idea of what's going on or who's using it, why. So it's really important that we have that capacity so that these open source model builders are getting the data, getting the sort of intelligence, putting it back into the model to keep improving it and keep doing this. And this is something that is happening 100% happening within OpenAI, within Anthropic, within a lot of these big labs. And open source is just not doing that. And by the way, it's not just something that these national AI model builders or public research labs face. It's something that Meta faces also, right? Meta, giant billion-dollar company trying to release open source models, also has a hard time.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that explanation. So public AI, and now increasingly governments are talking about sovereign AI, and certainly in the UK, and you will know this, that the UK government is very keen on ensuring that the UK has a level and is looking to build up a level of sovereign AI. How are public AI and sovereign AI related?
I really think of public and sovereign AI as kind of two sides of the same coin, right? And actually you see this directly even in Spain, where they have a sovereign AI strategy, but actually mostly the government talks about, like in its public communications, it's really starting to really adopt the public AI language, right? And that's because public AI is in many ways sovereign AI. It's, often provisioned or funded by governments to benefit a population, but it's public facing. It's about public access, public accountability. It's about building highways, right? Rather than necessarily missiles or a certain kind of like national security hardware. Now, there's still sovereign AI that, especially in the national security context, that doesn't necessarily have to fall under the rubric of public AI. But in practice, especially when we're talking about these large language models, they have to be, or they're really intended for many, many use cases. They are this classic example of a dual use technology, right? Where yes, it's important for national security, for sovereign control purposes, but it's also like really, really important to invest in for the public benefit.
So how is value from public AI actually realized?
So I think part of it comes from just building good products. So when you have a good model, like Switzerland recently released, people adopt it, they put it into their workflows, they use it just like they use ChatGPT, or enterprises use it. And that ultimately improves and gives value back to the public, right? So the Swiss model is specifically designed for multilingual, and Switzerland's a very multilingual country, right? It responds in ways that are actually culturally Swiss. I find that kind of funny sometimes when I'm talking to it, and it also follows the specific kind of linguistic patterns of the Swiss. So, for example, Swiss German is quite different from High German, or the Germany in German, the German in Germany. And Apertus kind of respects that because it's designed to, it's trained to, right? I think there are other things that are going to emerge over time where countries and industries and companies realize, hey, it's really important that we have our own localization of these large language models.
Yeah.
Otherwise, something is lost in our culture, but also in our ability to produce things and to do business in the way that we want to.
You've mentioned Apertus a couple of times. Just unpack this for us. What is this?
So Apertus is a large language model. It's a 70 billion parameter model trained by the Swiss National AI Initiative, which is a combination of ETH Zurich, EPFL, and the Swiss National Supercomputing Center. And Apertus is effectively the leading European model right now in its class, and almost certainly the leading sovereign model, if you want to think about it that way. It is also, I think, one of the world's first and best no theft models. So the Swiss really put in a huge amount of effort to take the internet, the typical trading data set, Common Crawl, and cut out all the parts where there was any kind of question about whether or not this was copyrighted or not, right? Or it was not the right kind of copyright. So it's perhaps one of the first models that is not guilty of the original sin of AI, which is that all the AIs that we typically use, they have stolen so much data. This is why they are getting sued all the time, right? By the New York Times, by many, many different publishers around the world, by artists and creators. And this is a model that doesn't have that. So all these things, that's Apertus.
But then surely that model is, or could be deemed to be, incomplete because it's not based on the data that is available.
You could say it's incomplete, or maybe it's sort of saying it's begging for partners and creators to come in and supplement it and ideally get some sort of economic reward. So in public AI, we often talk about effectively the Spotify model of revenue share, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of artists and content creators put their material, their music on and their podcasts onto Spotify, and they get a little bit of money. What we are trying to do, or what we think is possible, is to work more directly with these publishers. So instead of waiting for a lawsuit from them, we go to them and say, hey, BBC, hey, Elsevier, hey, I don't know, Universal Studios, I think your content is part of the global library of civilization. It should be available to people, but also you need to be compensated for what you've done and the work you put in. And we want to integrate that by making calls to your data set through an API or through an MCP server or through various kinds of AI tooling, and then just compensate you whenever our LLM does that, right? So I think that's a different and really interesting way of proceeding that, yes, wants to sort of have that data, be able to call it, but doesn't necessarily depend on stealing it.
The concept of public AI is, and the development that you're talking about here, Josh, is a very different way of proceeding with how AI itself is going to develop. It's moving away from this proprietary model with these companies kind of competing over their proprietary models to something which is much more in the public domain and owned for the benefit of the public domain. I mean, can you see these big companies kind of just allowing public AI to take over?
So these companies, well, let's put it this way. We do have private partners, right? But they're usually not model builders themselves. Okay. I expect companies like OpenAI and Anthropic to play nice in the beginning because it doesn't cost them anything. They probably want to sort of earn brownie points with various governments and civil society people. But at some point, they're going to turn around and say, oh, this is threatening my market share. Maybe in the UK, if you decide this is really important to invest in. Maybe in Switzerland, maybe in other places. Hopefully by then, it'll be too late. Hopefully by then, the open source option, the public option, will be strong enough and useful enough that people just want to use it, right? That said, I want to be absolutely clear. It is going to be, it's just a very tall mountain to climb right now to compete directly with ChatGPT, to compete directly with Claude or Claude Code. And we're not trying to do that, right? We're trying to find here like a specific niche, maybe with the public sector, maybe with, civil society, maybe with academia, maybe with, specific communities even, where we can deploy public AI and help solve some people's problems, right? Maybe offer a lower price, maybe offer a very specific service. We're not trying to compete directly with these companies, at least not right now. But I'll just be honest with you. That is, of course, the ultimate vision. Like, none of what I say would make sense as public AI if it wasn't eventually trying to be an actual real alternative to the proprietary products.
Josh, thank you for that really in-depth answer. Are there risks for countries or nations to pursue a sovereign AI strategy?
Are there risks? Oh my gosh. The answer is yes. To be quite honest with you, I usually say to the ministers and the various policymakers I talk to that sovereign AI is broken right now. In most countries, governments are putting hundreds of millions and even hundreds of billions into AI, into data centers, built infrastructure, model training, and it's kind of failing. The typical example I usually give is something like, I mentioned that ChatGPT has around 80% of the global consumer chatbot market, right? Mm-hmm. The leading sovereign competitor, so Mistral's Le Chat, has around 4% market adoption in France, its home market, right? If you're investing right now in these models or this infrastructure for the sake of like sovereignty, how much sovereignty are you really getting, right? Is 4% a lot of sovereignty? Of course, this just comes back to my point earlier that it's just really, really hard to compete directly with these companies. They have the scale, they have the distribution, they have boatloads of money, right? It's hard for, in, let's say, middle power countries, like France, the UK, Germany, Spain, to really compete directly because your homegrown competitors, whether it's your private national champions like Mistral or Cohere in Canada, or it's your public labs like universities like Bangor or Cambridge or Swiss AI or AI Sweden or the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, none of these entities have necessarily the capital to compete or the total addressable market, let's say. There are a lot of answers that we have been pulling together to try to mitigate or address some of these risks, including this large project called Airbus for AI. But I'll say that, is it a risk? Yes. But is it worth it? Is your country's sovereignty and autonomy and ability to make your own choices in technology, is that important? I think that's, I suppose, up to the governments and the population to decide for themselves.
Do you think governments can buy AI sovereignty? I mean, can they actually ever achieve AI sovereignty? Is it just a matter of investment?
I think it is not just a matter of investment, though. Let's be clear. Money does matter here. It really does. Like, these are not cheap things you can just kind of make up. They take a lot of investment and foresight. In terms of whether, how governments really can or should get sovereignty, that's a slightly different question. If I had to put myself out there, so here's a distinction. You could have sovereign AI without having autarkic AI, right? Sovereignty doesn't mean everything has to be built in the UK or in France or in Germany. There's lots of ways of partnering with, allied countries or organizations, or making use of kind of multilateral infrastructure that doesn't, compromise to a significant degree your sovereignty. And I really, really try to make this point because you kind of, for countries like the UK to really compete at the frontier, you have to be willing to work with other people. You have to do it at the compute level, at the data level, at a markets level. It's really, really hard for you to do it on your own.
Josh, I wondered if you could explain, or no, let's start again. I mean, this notion of public AI seems really important because we're talking about putting the power back in the hands of individual countries, and through those public investments, back in the hands of citizens, as opposed to, as you've explained it, being in the hands of a small number of very large companies, wherever these companies are located. But what is needed to get more countries to sign up to public AI and to take public AI really seriously?
Yeah. I think the interesting thing is a lot of countries really are taking it extremely seriously right now. Um, so I mentioned the countries like Switzerland, like the UK, even states within the US, right? Uh, Maine doesn't have the same interests as California,
Mhm.
right? And they are very much thinking like, hey, am I going to let these big companies come in, put some data centers, drive up our utility prices, drive up our water and electricity, and not return really any jobs? I mean, a lot of different sort of regions and countries are feeling these kinds of questions, fielding these kinds of questions. I think actually on the sort of main subject, it's not just the rich countries. I would think of like the UK as a pretty rich country. Switzerland is certainly a very rich country, right? As is Singapore. Uh, I think countries around the world, let's say, I don't know, the Dominican Republic or Argentina or Uganda, Rwanda, they are also thinking very much about these questions around public AI and sovereign AI. For example, in the Dominican Republic, there was this recent, interesting example where the government built a kind of like a complete AI chatbot to represent itself, right? The idea is that you could sort of go to the chatbot and maybe start renewing your driver's license.
Mhm.
You can see these kinds of experiments where governments are trying to figure out how can I improve improve public services, improve the functioning of government,
Yeah.
and they don't feel comfortable about just outsourcing that to a private company, much as a private company in a different country. They feel like they want to build it themselves, or at least fund it and control it themselves,
Yeah.
right? So I think many different countries are pursuing different strategies along this kind of public/sovereign AI spectrum.
And I guess given, and you've kind of touched on it earlier, but if I could just explore this a little bit in more detail. You talked about there being global tensions. I mean, given the geopolitical uncertainties, I guess, is public AI really possible?
I would say
Small
actually the
questions.
geopolitical, yeah, always the small questions actually. To be quite honest with you, I think public AI has been extremely successful because of actually those political tensions.
Okay.
It's because there's a sense in Europe that the current U.S. administration's attention is drifting away from Europe, and there's a sense of from everybody that they need to build their own. They need to have their own alternative, and that is driving a lot of interest in public AI. Maybe I didn't. It's possible my answer on what is the relationship between sovereign AI and public AI need to improve, but I really actually, in practice, when I'm talking to these governments, they immediately get the connection. They understand that if I want AI sovereignty, and that is like such a huge part of this conversation, and you can see how that is tied directly to these geopolitical tensions. I need to invest in these kinds of public, well, not public options, but I need to sort of tailor my public investment to produce products that people, companies, citizens actually want to use. And when you talk about it that way, public AI is effectively the product strategy for sovereign AI, because it has to be, right? And it has to be public investment because right now the private sector is not really incentivized anymore to do this kind of, to do this really quite risky thing and try to compete with OpenAI and Anthropic directly, right? If you're a UK company, if you are a UK AI company, it really doesn't make sense anymore for you to try to compete with these very, very large and very, very well-funded companies, right?
Yeah.
That's the sense in which I think very much public AI is part of this moment.
Josh, thank you so much for joining me on the AI podcast today. I was really keen to have you on because I think this notion of public AI is really a very interesting concept at this moment in time, given the geopolitical tensions, given the amount of interest that governments, and I've spoken to and looked at countries in different regions of the world, and just about everyone is interested in understanding how they can ensure that their citizens' data, that the AI services, that the models that are being developed have some sovereignty, have some traction in their home countries. So this notion of public AI is for me absolutely fascinating. And thank you for pursuing this and explaining it to the listeners in this episode. So I really appreciate you joining me on the AI Adoption Podcast.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me, Ashley.